Good morning, everyone. This is quite an exciting backdrop that we have picked. I mentioned that the last time the senator was in town for a press conference, you may remember this, we were at the Little Lamps coffee shop talking about the esoteric subject of tax reform, and a reporter actually tweeted, and you know who you are, good thing we're in a coffee shop this morning. So today we've picked a much more dramatic setting. It's sure to keep your attention. Bridges. We're talking about bridges. Bridges really define Harrisburg. If you think about Harrisburg, you think about the majestic bridges that roll across the Susquehanna. You think about the Mulberry Street Bridge or the State Street Bridge, which connect our Allison Hill section with our downtown. What you may not know is that there are a variety of smaller bridges that are structurally deficient and in need of great repair. We've chosen this spot because it overlooks the Paxton Creek. And those of you may or may not know that originally that creek was designed as a part of the City Beautiful movement to help move sewage as quickly as possible out of the city. It now handles mostly stormwater. But there are a series of bridges, including the two behind us, right here and right there, and the one over on Market Street there, that are in horrible need of repair. In fact, the bridge on Market Street was recently inspected in 2015 and found to be deficient, and these are going to cost millions and millions of dollars to repair. While the city has some resources, it's never enough. And what we need to do is we need to talk about how we can get federal resources applied to local projects like these bridges. Now, we're joined today by a variety of distinguished guests, especially our county commissioners. We have Mike Prees, George Hartwick, and Jeff Haste. These are all gentlemen who have been working throughout all of Dauphin County to make sure that we repair all of our bridges. We are also joined by Jonathan Hendrickson from Senator Teplitz's office. Good to see you, Jonathan, new on the job. And we have Tim Reardon. Where's Tim? Wave. Well, Tim couldn't make it. And that's all right. And Elijah Yerrick. Good to see all of you from our Tri-County Planning. This is truly both a regional effort, the city and the county working together, but also a bipartisan effort. You have Democrats and Republicans all united on the importance of infrastructure. And we are very fortunate to have a senator who is on our side and who understands the importance of infrastructure and who recognizes the importance of helping define funding for things as important as the bridges, which literally unite our community and keep us together. It is my great pleasure to introduce our senator, your senator, Senator Bob Casey.
Thanks, Mayor. Good to be with you. Thanks. Well, Mayor, thank you very much for being with us today and for acting as an MC as well. It's always important to have an MC, especially when you're in a major city like Harrisburg in our state. And I'm grateful for the mayor's leadership, not only on issues that relate to transportation infrastructure, but of course on so many other issues. It's a very tough job, and I'm surrounded at this podium by executives. I'm a legislator, and I think if my father were here, he'd say that executives have tougher jobs. I say that to all three commissioners, Commissioner Hayes, Commissioner Hartwick, and Commissioner Prees, as well as the mayor, and the bipartisan nature of what we have here. Democrats and Republicans coming together to talk about a fundamental issue, the issue of bridges and I guess the broader issue of transportation. When I consider this issue, I try to focus on two basic concerns. You could probably list 4 or 5, but two basic concerns. One is safety, and the other, of course, is economic growth, because both are at stake when it comes to what happens to our bridges. And I want to focus as well on kind of two concepts. One is this issue of off-system bridges, bridges that are maintained by a county or municipality. They're not on a long national highway list of bridges, the so-called on-system. So off-system bridges, one thing I'll talk about today. And in addition to that, structurally deficient bridges. And we'll talk about that as well as part of this policy. We know that, for example, whether it's here in Harrisburg or Dauphin County or throughout the state, the off-system bridges are bridges that we're all familiar with, but we sometimes forget how important they are to a local community. These are the bridges that carry school buses full of children throughout the school year. These are the bridges that carry emergency vehicles when you have a disaster or an emergency. And of course, to the bridges that allow us to have commerce, that carry commercial vehicles. And I guess fourth would be commuters. So for kids to get to school, people to get to work, or for goods to move, we need to make sure that these bridges are safe. We need to make sure that they're functional to the point where they're not in any way compromised. We know that in Dauphin County alone, there are some 438 total bridges. 171 of them at last count are off-system bridges. So that means that in this county alone, about 39% of the bridges are off-system bridges. Just in Dauphin County, that's a number that's comparable to the state in national numbers. But here's the problem. Not just a challenge maintaining off-system bridges here in Dauphin County and throughout the Commonwealth, but the other challenge is the number of on and off-system bridges that are structurally deficient. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania ranks #1 in a category we don't want to be #1 in, and that's structurally deficient bridges. Out of the roughly 22,000 bridges in the state, some 5,543 bridges in Pennsylvania are structurally deficient. So we've got two challenges that are, in a sense, overlapping. Off-system bridges need to be maintained, and structurally deficient bridges overall. Almost 25% of all of Pennsylvania's bridges are structurally deficient. That's a higher number than the nation. Across the nation, it's only about 10%. So that 5,543 represents 25%. And we know that many of the very high percentage of the off-system bridges are structurally deficient. Here's part of the policy problem. A couple of years ago, when transportation policy changed, in the federal government was created a National Highway Performance Program. And this is a program that supports the maintenance of our highway systems. That new program supports only projects on the so-called NHS, the National Highway System. By virtue of that change, the policy left out a lot of bridges. Across the country, some 467,000, or I should say more than 467,000 bridges are left out. So you have a program now that currently only serves a very small percentage, by one estimate maybe only 10% of all the bridges in the country. So what do we do about that? Well, in addition to working as I am working, and people in both parties are working, trying to get a new transportation bill done. The next and most important deadline is the end of July. That's when the trust fund runs out, and that's when the program has been extended to temporarily. So we've got a big deadline at the end of July, and I think there's a substantial degree of pressure, appropriate pressure, that would be brought to bear on people in both parties, in both houses, to get something done by the end of July. As part of that broader policy on transportation, I want to make sure that we do two things. Number one is to extend, or I should say enlarge, the eligibility for all bridges to get more funding. So that would mean restoring funding eligibility to all bridges across the country. That doesn't mean that every bridge will get funded, of course, but we want to enlarge or expand the number of bridges that are at least eligible for funding. And we should do that in the context of the overall transportation bill, which, as I said, is not done yet, and we still have a lot of work to do on that. The second thing I want to do is to maintain a policy that Senator Blunt of Missouri, Republican Senator from Missouri, and I have done together, and that's to focus again on these off-system bridges. By changing an allocation, not necessarily getting new dollars, because sometimes that's all but impossible, but I hope we can do that when it comes to the overall transportation bill. But just on the bridge part of the transportation bill, and just further down in terms of specificity, the off-system bridges, we want to make sure that that 15% set aside is maintained for off-system bridges. We did that a couple of years ago, just by having that allocation up to 15%. Pennsylvania was able to get more than $70 million for off-system bridges that we weren't getting before. So we want to maintain that bipartisan policy when it comes to off-system bridges in the context of the larger transportation bill and, of course, in the context of bridge policy overall. So here in Dauphin County and throughout our Commonwealth, we need to make sure that the bridges that are often the ones that are doing the most work, in a sense, carrying our kids to school on school buses, getting our goods to market, and making sure that economic growth is possible, and doing everything we can to make sure those same bridges are there when there's an emergency. We don't want the nightmare of an emergency vehicle not being able to cross a bridge because there wasn't enough consensus, Democrats and Republicans coming together to improve the policy. So I would say to my friends in Washington, House, Senate, Democrat, and Republican, I would hope you would imitate and take inspiration from the bipartisanship that's standing behind me today. Democratic commissioner, Democratic mayor, Republican commissioners here today to come together to say this is very, very important for Dauphin County, for South Central Pennsylvania, and for our Commonwealth. And lastly, we should take inspiration from what was done here in Harrisburg in the General Assembly a couple of years ago with Democrats and Republicans in the General Assembly coming together with Governor Corbett at the time to make sure that a transportation bill got done. We need to make sure that that same bipartisanship takes place in Washington in the next couple of weeks to get a transportation bill, to insist that we continue to fund our off-system bridges, and to make sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce the number of structurally deficient bridges. And if we do that work, maybe Pennsylvania can move down the list and be second or third, or I hope someday 50th on the list of structurally deficient bridges, not number one like we are today. So I wanted to take questions either here or individually, unless the commissioners have any commissioner, if they wanted to say a few words, we certainly have time for that.
Senator?
Yes. Yes.
You were here basically exactly like a year ago touting the same
Right.
issues. I mean, what has changed within that past year, and why are you back here again?
Well, good question. What has changed is not much, but in some ways there have been changes. Not much in the sense of we still have not gotten a consensus in the Congress about how to put forward a transportation bill, which, as I should have said before, we don't want a transportation bill that's going to last 6 months or a year, 18 months. I think most people want a 6-year bill that has substantial commitment to the nation's transportation infrastructure, so we can fix bridges, we can repair roads, and make sure that the basics of one part of our infrastructure challenge is dealt with. So not much has changed in terms of a lack of a consensus, but we do have, I think, a greater sense of urgency now that we have this July deadline coming up, and that we're seeing, you don't have to go a week or more to see across the country the failure to invest in infrastructure. And we need to make sure, just as we were debating recently about Amtrak, even if you could make the case that horrific tragedy that you and I just spoke about a moment ago was not connected to funding, we don't know if there is a connection. But I would argue, even apart from that, Amtrak, just like the rest of our transportation infrastructure, needs to be invested in. But bridges might be the most dramatic example of what happens when you don't invest.
How do you propose to fund that and sell that to the rest of Congress?
Well, we don't have an agreement on that, and we're considering now a couple of different options. I think the key to this, to be blunt about it, will be what happens in the House. The House has, I think, some consensus in terms of policy, in terms of what needs to be done, but not enough consensus in terms of funding. And I think if the House can come up with a funding agreement, and it's good that Pennsylvania has a chairman. We have Chairman Schuster there, who's working with his House colleagues to try to get that done. I think if they can resolve that in the House, which is mostly an intra-party, meaning intra-Republican Party debate, if they can work that out in the House, I think that'll help enormously to get it done in the Senate.
What's your proposal, though?
I don't have a specific proposal in terms of funding. I want to see what they can agree to in the House and see if that's something we can accept. But there are a whole range of options. One of the most recent is kind of a repatriation, bringing dollars back from overseas. That's certainly something we're looking at. Anybody else? I'm under the shade here, and I know some are not, so I want to be mindful of that, but I'm certainly going to be around for a while. Unless any commissioner, I don't want to give, as a legislator, I want to make sure that the executives have a chance to speak if they want to.
I'll just say thank you to Senator Casey. As he's mentioned, this has been a project that's been critical to County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania, to the National Association of County Officials. And over the last couple of years, we've stopped in, and Senator Casey and his staff have been spot on the issues and the subject. Two of the things he mentioned about it, the priorities. The other priority, it really is streamlining the process of the federal bridges for locals to deal with, and Senator Casey and his staff understand that. The importance that I think he said, if you're trying to think about those off-structure bridges, as I was thinking, those off-structure bridges are the bridges that we drive on first thing in the morning and probably the last thing at night when we're going home or going to work. And as he said, our school children are on there, but they're the first ones we go across. They're the ones that sometimes we drive down a road and don't even realize there's a bridge there. And all of a sudden, when they're doing a repair, we're like, oh, shoot, I didn't know there was a bridge. Those are the ones he's talking about. And we've worked very hard, as he has said, here in Pennsylvania to not be number one. A lot of kudos go to the governor and the legislature for getting us there. But Senator Casey has been a strong leader on this. And to answer your question, not for him, but to explain his position, why he doesn't have a position. His position is the one that's going to win and pass. And it's going to be a long-term fix, not a short-term solution. And so we want to say thank you to Senator Casey for your leadership. Thank you.
So we are here at the Paxton Creek underneath the Mulberry Bridge, right by the old post office building. It should be noted this is an area where we'd really like to see Harrisburg redevelop. We changed the zoning to business general for the area behind us, and we're not going to see that type of redevelopment unless we address the underlying infrastructure. And within a span of a quarter mile here, we have 3 different bridges, all of which are structurally impaired in some way. Can you talk a little bit about how old these bridges are, Wayne, and why it is that the city hasn't already fixed them?
Yeah, certainly, Mayor. Thank you. We're looking at 2 of the off-system bridges right now. These carry traffic 10th Street over Paxton Creek. They're both structurally deficient, about 1,000 foot up Paxton Creek. We have Market Street Bridge, which carries 8,000 people a day, also structurally deficient. That one is on the National Highway System, so under the current funding scheme, that one would be funded if the funds exist. But we heard Senator Casey talk earlier about the off-system bridges. Here's 2 prime examples. You can see the fascia beam, severe deterioration of the concrete. Why hasn't the city fixed this in the past? Funding, of course. The cost to replace these bridges would be in the millions. The cost to do some repair that maybe would last a year or less would be in the tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And I think what Senator Casey is pushing for is a federal transportation bill that's going to free up funding so that we can advocate for funding of bridges just like these.
Right, to fund all bridges regardless. I mean, a bridge is such a critical structure. I mean, under the federal requirements, they're inspected every 2 years because the catastrophic event of a collapse. And so, what happens is we get these inspection reports and they have recommendations, but there's no funds to make any of the necessary repair.
And like a lot of our infrastructure, it's very old. The Paxton Creek repairs go back to the city. Beautiful movement. The Market Street Bridge you mentioned is 110 years old.
119 plus or minus, yes, sir.
And in here, I know these bridges are 65 years old and 50 years, respectively. They're old, and they're in need of attention. And as this whole area develops, as we hope it will, and takes increasingly more traffic, we've got to pay attention to the infrastructure. And it's also interesting to point out you've got demolition occurring on the other side of Cameron Street. You've got some activity over here. You've got millions of dollars being invested in the Mulberry Street Bridge, and we're looking to see that the Mulberry Street Bridge is sort of an anchor into our Mulder Square area of Harrisburg. But you really can see infrastructure as sort of phase one in any type of community revitalization. Do you have a sense of how many bridges are similar to this in Harrisburg, or how Harrisburg might benefit by an overall transportation bill?
Locally owned bridges, there's 22. Some of those structures are small, closed to traffic now. But of the structurally deficient that are open to traffic, these three here are the ones that come to mind. Certainly any of those are in need of repair.